Today I want to share with you a traditional bone-in pot roast recipe. And I'm also going to share with you the importance of making sure that you always cook your meat on the bone. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary from marysnest.com and author of the Modern Pioneer Cookbook, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen. Let's go over the ingredients that we're going to need to make this bone-in pot roast. And the first thing is a chuck roast, a bone-in chuck roast, and you want one that's between 3 to 4 pounds. Now for browning the meat, you're going to want 2 tablespoons of beef tallow. Now if you don't have beef tallow, you can use clarified butter or ghee, or you can also use equal parts of butter and olive oil. Now you can certainly buy beef tallow, but if you'd like to learn how to render your own from beef suet, I have a very detailed video where I walk you through the entire process step by step, and I'll be sure to link to that in the description below. For browning the meat, the only other things that you're going to need are salt, and I like to use a fine ground sea salt, and some freshly ground black pepper. Now to make the braising liquid that we're going to cook our chuck roast in to make our pot roast, you're going to want 1 onion. I've just got a medium yellow onion here, but any onion you have will be fine. And then you're going to want a carrot and 2 stalks of celery and some tomato paste and some Worcestershire sauce, a couple of bay leaves, and then let's talk about this ingredient. What I have here is Madeira. This is a fortified wine. Now, we don't drink, so I like to keep fortified wines on hand because they are basically made from wine, but with added ingredients that keep them a little fresher longer in your pantry, as opposed to a bottle of wine that once opened may become vinegary over time. So if you do drink and you have dry red wine in your house, you can certainly use that as your deglazing liquid that we'll use once we brown up our chuck roast. But as I said, I like to keep fortified wines on hand, and Madeira works great in this recipe. Now, if you don't have Madeira, but you have other fortified wines, maybe you've got port, maybe you've got Marsala, maybe you've got a dry sherry or some dry vermouth, all of those will work fine as well. And you probably have them on hand if you're making bone broth. Because if you followed my bone broth recipes, you know that I always like to use a fortified wine as opposed to vinegar to help leach out the collagen from the bones and to make a very nice tasting bone broth. And I'll be sure to link to my bone broth playlist in the description below. Now the only other things you'll need for finishing off your pot roast is going to be 1.5 pounds of carrots, and that's approximately about 10 carrots. You're going to need 1.5 pounds of small waxy potatoes. You can use red skin potatoes or yellow skin potatoes, whatever you have on hand. Small ones work great, but the most important thing is that you want them to be waxy potatoes, because waxy potatoes, which are your thin-skinned potatoes, will hold their shape better in this type of recipe. You're also going to want 2 medium onions. Again, I just have the yellow ones here, but whatever you have will work great. You're going to want a little parsley. I like to use the flat leaf Italian parsley, but either one will work if you've got the curly parsley. And then you're going to want to have some fresh thyme as well. Now the first thing that we're going to do is generously season our piece of meat here, our bone-in chuck roast, and we're going to season it with the fine ground sea salt and some freshly ground cracked pepper. Now I'm going to flip this over, we'll season the other side, and then I'll take you over to my stove top. Before we head over to the stove, I just want to mention that you're going to need some type of heavy pot. I've got a Dutch oven here, but if you have a heavy stainless steel pot, that'll work fine too. So let's head over to the stove. We're going to sear our pot roast, and then we'll make the braising liquid. And then just go ahead and put in the fat that you're using, whether it's the tallow or the ghee or the clarified butter or the olive oil and butter combination. Just get all of that into your Dutch oven or whatever pot you're using. Now you want to heat your fat on medium heat And then you're going to want to go ahead and put your meat in. Once you hear it, you hear the fat sizzling. Now we're going to sear this for about 5 minutes till it becomes a nice brown color on one side, and then we're going to flip it over and brown it for another 5 minutes on the other side. And I want to let you know the reason that I recommend using tallow is because tallow has a very high smoke point, number one, so it doesn't get easily damaged when searing meats. And secondly, it's a nutrient-dense food. It's very rich in vitamins, and that adds nutrition to the overall pot roast dish. So I've flipped over the chuck roast, and now we're going to brown it on the other side for 5 minutes. Once the chuck roast is browned on both sides, remove it to a plate, and now pour in your Madeira to deglaze your pan. Now just use your spatula to loosen any little bits, that's the fond, any little bits that are on the bottom of your pan. And turn your heat down to low. Well, while the Madeira is simmering on low to allow some of the alcohol to evaporate, go ahead and chop up your 1 carrot, your 2 stalks of celery, and your 1 onion for the braising liquid. And don't throw out your scraps. Save them and put them in your scrap bag to use for the next time you make bone broth. Now you may be wondering why I didn't tie up my chuck roast when I went to sear it in the pan. And the reason is I find that with a chuck roast, which is a fatty cut, the fat renders much better when it's just left in its, I guess you could say, relaxed position, as opposed to being all tied up. A pot roast is the type of meat that is basically cooked to the point where it's exceptionally tender, and you can shred it, you can slice it, and you really don't need to make such an effort to try to keep it all together. What can happen sometimes is that the fat doesn't render well into the liquid, and then you may have some bits and bobs, so to speak, of fat left on the meat even after a good long roasting or a good long braising. So some people will do a little meticulous cutting away of fat from the chuck roast and possibly discard it. I'm not sure what they do with it, but you don't want to do that, because just like the beef tallow, the fat from your chuck roast is a nutrient-dense food. And by letting that render into the braising liquid and then turning the braising liquid later into a wonderful sauce for your pot roast adds nutrition to this meal. So put your chopped carrot, celery, and onion into whatever liquid you've used to deglaze your pan, stir it around a little bit, and then place your meat back into your Dutch oven or whatever pot that you're using and place the meat right on top of the vegetables. Then you're going to add water sufficient to come up the sides of your chuck roast. Now my chuck roast is about 3.5 pounds, and I added 4 cups of water. But you don't want to completely submerge your chuck roast. You do want the top to be visible and above the water. Now we're going to add in the rest of our ingredients. We're going to go ahead and add in 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce, 3 tablespoons of tomato paste, and a couple of bay leaves. I'm going to use 2. You can just give everything a little stir, but now we're going to turn this up to high, and we're going to bring this up to a boil. Once it comes up to a boil, we're going to immediately turn it down to low, and now we have some options. You can let it simmer on low on your stovetop, or if you prefer, you can transfer it to a 325-degree Fahrenheit oven. Now I'm going to cook my pot roast on the stovetop. This is the way that I really like to cook because I live in Central Texas. It's relatively warm here most of the year, and so I prefer not to put the oven on for a total of 3 to 4 hours. But if you do want to use your oven, at this point, you're going to transfer your Dutch oven or whatever pot you're using. Just make sure it's oven proof if you want to finish this in your oven, and go ahead and transfer it into your preheated 325 Fahrenheit oven. And you're going to cook your chuck roast to turn it into a luscious pot roast for 1 hour per pound of chuck roast. So my chuck roast is 3.5 pounds, so I'm going to be cooking this on my stovetop for 3.5 hours. If you're doing this in the oven, the amount of time is the same, 3.5 hours. You're going to cook it on 325 Fahrenheit or low heat on your cooktop. Approximately 45 minutes to an hour before the pot roast is finished is when we'll go ahead and add in our actual vegetables. What we put in earlier, the diced up, chopped up carrots, celery, onion, is for flavoring for the braising liquid, and then additional flavoring for the sauce that we'll make once the pot roast is finished. But these are going to be your main vegetables, and they're going to take less time to cook than the chuck roast is going to take to cook to turn into a pot roast. So at about 45 minutes or an hour before your time is coming up, in my case 3.5 hours, I'll go ahead at 2.5 hours and add in my carrots, potatoes, and onions. Now, an hour before, 45 minutes before, a lot's going to depend on the size of the vegetables that you're adding. My carrots, for the most part, are pretty thin, so may they take 45 minutes? Maybe so. But this is home cooking. It's not an exact science. They're not going to completely dissolve whether you put them in at the hour mark or the 45-minute mark. The bigger concern in terms of making sure that these vegetables are fully cooked are going to be the potatoes. And I've got these small little potatoes here. If you have larger potatoes, you can cut them in half, or you can just give them a little longer cooking time. Often, if you're boiling up potatoes like this, it can take maybe only 20 minutes. But since we're simmering on a low heat with less liquid, I do like to give them a little more time. And that's why I'm saying 45 minutes to an hour. And we'll also add in our fresh thyme and our parsley at that point. Now, for the thyme, I've got about 10 sprigs or so of fresh thyme. If you don't have fresh thyme, don't worry, you can add some dry thyme. And for the parsley, I'm just going to chop off enough that'll give me about 3 tablespoons of the parsley once it's chopped up. I'll have all this detail and explanation about amounts and what times to add things in and so on and so forth in the detailed printable recipe over on my website, marysnest.com, and the link will be in the description below. Now, before we prep our vegetables to add to our chuck roast that's simmering, I want to take a minute to talk with you about why I stressed cooking the chuck roast to make a pot roast on the bone. If you're not familiar with Dr. Catherine Shanahan, author of Deep Nutrition, I highly recommend this book if you're interested in traditional foods cooking, and I think you might be if you've been with me for a while. You know that I always focus on true traditional preparations of recipes the way our ancestors made them. And our ancestors always cooked their meat on the bone, whether it was a beef or lamb or a chicken, a whole chicken. And it really wasn't until modern times that people started wanting everything that was boneless or skinless, and so on and so forth, with your typical, boneless, skinless chicken breast. And for some reason, people got it into their heads that they didn't want to pay for the bone, the weight of the bones. They just wanted to pay for the meat, thinking that the meat was the most nutritious. And of course, yes, the meat is nutritious, but so are the bones. And the bones do something very special to the meat when the meat is cooked on the bone the way it was meant to be cooked. If you have this book, turn to page 242, where Dr. Shanahan is discussing the secret to creating tasty and nutritious meat. And what is the secret? She writes, the secret? Leave it on the bone. Thanksgiving dinner is, for many, the most memorable meal of the year, which happens to be centered on a large bird, slow-cooked whole. When cooking meat, the more everything stays together, fat, bone, marrow, skin, and other connective tissue, the better. This section will introduce you to the simple technique that primitive and haute cuisine, fancy cooking, haute cuisine, use to make meat taste succulent, juicy, and complex. The better the material you start with, the better it tastes, and the better it is for you. For that reason and more, animals raised humanely and pastured on mineral-rich soil are best. And that's why I've always talked with you that as you venture on your traditional foods journey and you stop buying a lot of pre-prepared and processed food at the grocery store, you then have a little more money in your grocery budget to buy a better grade of meat, chicken, so on and so forth. And when you can start to afford beef that is pasture raised, and it's becoming more affordable because it's a supply and demand, more and more people are wanting pasture raised grass-fed meat, and so you have more and more ranches transitioning over to providing grass-fed meat. And I've seen it become more affordable over the years. And well, in any event, so that's what she says, that the mineral-rich soil, those raised on pasture and mineral-rich soil are best. And she says, and she goes on in the whole chapter, I'll show you the 4 rules you need to know to preserve and enhance the taste and nutrition of all our precious animal-derived items. And I'll show you the science that explains why mastering the art of cooking meat in the first step toward capturing the true power of food. And basically, I'll just give you a little preview, but I highly recommend this book. The bottom line is, cooking it on the bone allows the bone to release certain nutrients into the meat that makes our digestive system, makes it easier for our digestive system to absorb the vitamins and minerals that are in the meat. Bones are rich in collagen. Collagen nourishes our digestive tract. A nourished and healthy digestive tract can better absorb the nutrients from the food that we eat. And in the case of cooking your meat on the bone, allows you to better absorb those nutrients that are specific to meat. Plus, the collagen, as well as the marrow in the bone, not only add nutrition to your meal, they also add flavor. Other tips Dr. Shanahan shares is that with your tough cuts like your chuck roast and your rump roast and so on and so forth, low and slow is the best way to cook it. And if you're cooking your more expensive cuts of meat, like maybe a T-bone or a New York strip on the bone, you want to lean more to quick cooking, so that you're eating those meats more on the rare side. So how you cook the meat depends on what particular cuts you have. However, no matter what cut you have, you always want to make sure that you're cooking your meat on the bone. Whether you're cooking your chuck roast on the stovetop or in the oven, it's a good idea to check on it after about an hour and a half. You just want to make sure that the liquid is sufficient, and if you want, this can be a good time to flip the chuck roast over so that the part that's above the braising liquid will now be submerged under the braising liquid. This can help expedite the rendering of the fat that's in your chuck roast, and the more that's rendered out into the braising liquid makes for a wonderful, flavorful, and nutritious sauce. Since a lot of my carrots were quite thick on the bottom, yet then quite thin on the top, what I decided to do was go ahead and split the thicker parts to just help everything cook evenly. Then what I do with the onions is after I peel them, I quarter them. But when I quarter them, I try to leave some of the stem in. And that helps the quarter of the onion stay together. And this is very nice when you go to serve it, because along with some of the meat, some of the carrots, some of the potatoes, you also can get a nice wedge or two of onion. Over here I've got my potatoes, just my little yellow potatoes. I'm going to keep them whole. I like it both for serving and presentation. And since they're small, they'll cook up in the braising liquid in that hour to 45 minutes in no time at all. I also have my thyme here, my sprigs of thyme, which I've tied together with some kitchen twine. And I've got my flat leaf Italian parsley here that I've chopped up, approximately 3 tablespoons. But this is home cooking. It's not an exact science. I put my vegetables in when there was basically just an hour left of cooking time. So for example, if you have a 4-pound chuck roast, you could flip it at 2 hours and then put your veggies in at the 3-hour mark, so on and so forth. Well, the pot roast looks lovely. And I've put it on a platter here. It's not finished yet though, because I'm going to show you how we're going to make this wonderful nutrient-dense sauce. But I've got the carrots, the potatoes, the onions. It's really looking great. And I actually had, my platter wasn't large enough to hold all the vegetables, so I've got some overflow over here. But it looks wonderful. Now what I want to show you with this bone, because when you make something like a pot roast and you start with a bone-in chuck roast, it literally becomes truly falling off the bone tender. And you'll be able to lift the bone right out. And what you want to make sure to do is any of the marrow in the bone that's softened, just push it out with a knife and drop it down into your original braising liquid. Now, in your braising liquid, you may also find pieces of sinew that have just loosened and fallen right off of the meat. You want to keep these in your original braising liquid. You do want to remove the bay leaves, but you want to leave all the little pieces of vegetables that were part of the original carrot, celery, and onion mixture that we used to make this braising liquid. So you're going to have the little bits and bobs of vegetables in there, and the sinew, and any other, you may have some pieces of fat that haven't, like a little bit of fat remaining here. Whoops, it's falling off. It's so ready to dissolve. That little bits of fat that just may not have completely dissolved yet, that's fine, don't worry, because you're going to see what we're going to do with that. First, off the heat, we're going to puree this mixture, this braising liquid, with all the little bits and bobs of a little bit of fat, a little bit of sinew, whatever in there. If you don't have one of these handheld blenders, you can just puree this in batches in a regular blender or a high-speed blender, whatever you have. I'm just going to put a little dish towel here to control, or corral, I should say, any splattering. Now, once this is perfectly pureed, we're going to bring it back over to the stovetop, and we're going to put it on medium heat to start warming it. Then we're going to take a tablespoon of butter and a tablespoon of flour, and we're going to mash this together to make what the French call a beurre manière. And then we're going to take that little butter flour ball and we're going to put it into our warmed gravy here, our original braising liquid that now we're turning into a delicious gravy, a delicious sauce. And we'll bring it up to a boil, let it thicken a bit, and then we'll be ready to put some on our pot roast and serve dinner. Well, this sauce looks wonderful, and I'm just going to give it a little taste to see if it needs to be adjusted with a little salt or black pepper. Oh, I think that's perfect. Well, this is just glorious. The vegetables are cooked perfectly, the carrots tender, potatoes tender, the onions still have some body, yet are tender. Everything is perfect. And this literally, It literally was a falling off the bone pot roast. Well, let's give this a taste. I put some of that gravy on it. Remember, gravy sauce, whatever you want to call it, remember to make that because that is really nutrient dense. It's loaded with the collagen that was extracted from the bone while it was cooking, the marrow from the bone, the nutrients in the sinew, and the nutrients in the little bits and bobs of fat that hadn't quite dissolved yet. All nutrient dense, exactly what we want in our traditional foods kitchen. Alrighty, let's give this a taste. Really good. Very tender, very flavorful. This is going to be the best pot roast that you've ever had. Now, if you'd like more nutrient-dense recipes, be sure to click on this video over here where I have a whole playlist of how to make nutrient-dense meals and lots more. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.